Hugo Grotius, Property and Consent, by John Salter. Grotius' discussion of private property is usually regarded as a seminal work within the modern natural law tradition and a point of departure for the subsequent history of the subject. However, there is no settled understanding of some of Grotius' principal ideas, with the result that different interpretations have produced radically different histories. According to a widely held view, Grotius understood the original relationship between men and the natural world as a kind of positive community, in which all had equal joint rights to the earth's resources. The introduction of private property thus required a universal agreement to dissolve the original rights. Richard Schlatter interpreted Grotius in this way and concluded that Grotius based private ownership on a supposititious convention subscribed to by the whole human race. Natural law, no doubt, obliges men to respect that convention. Nevertheless, as he himself confesses, property is, according to his theory, a creation of human law. According to Richard Tuck, however, the general principle of occupation was not taken to be conventional. While there was no private property in the state of nature, natural man was the subject of rights. Moreover, the rights he possessed, although not strictly property rights, were not categorically dissimilar. Consequently, there was something natural in the development into the institution of private property of the basic and inherent human right to use the material world, and no agreement was ever necessary. Rather, all that was necessary was labor of some kind. Men had physically to take possession of the material object or to alter or define it in some way. He concludes that the agreement to institute private property is a very weak condition and is more the recognition of a right rather than what constitutes it. Schlatter and Tuck both argue that Grotius' theory of property was repudiated by Pufendorf. According to Schlatter, Pufendorf redefined the state of the world before the introduction of private property as a state of negative community, meaning nothing belongs to anyone. This, according to Schlatter, removed one reason for the agreement. Since men had no joint or overlapping rights in the state of nature, it was not necessary to assume that those rights must have been extinguished by universal consent. Pufendorf still needed a convention to show how it was possible for the seizure of things from the negative common to impose an obligation on others to respect the right of the first taker. So although Pufendorf had not entirely dispensed with the convention, he had made an important step in that direction and cleared the way for others, principally Locke, to establish the right of property as a natural right. Tuck thinks, however, that Pufendorf's principal innovation was his famous correlativity thesis. To have a right requires a corresponding obligation, and non-natural obligations, such as those governing property, require an agreement of some kind. According to Tuck, this argument was, in effect, a repudiation of Grotius's attempt to construct a natural rights theory. The target of Pufendorf's argument was Hobbes, not Grotius, but Grotius could not be preserved if Hobbes was to be refuted. To deny that the original state of man was one of war, it was necessary to deny that there was overlapping and thus conflicting natural rights. And the only way to deny this was to deny that there was any natural rights at all. My first aim in what follows is to attempt to shed some light on what appears to be two disputed areas: Grotius' understanding of how the primitive general right worked in practice, and the nature and significance of the agreement that accompanied the introduction of private property. Grotius argued that under the terms of the original grant of the world to mankind, everyone could take possession of what they needed, and the first one taking possession would have the right to use things not claimed and to consume them up to the limits of his needs. If this right to use things not claimed is to be understood as a right that is not categorically different from a property right, then there is no categorical difference between using things on the common and occupation. Tuck is then drawing the only appropriate conclusion when he asserts that the agreement is a weak condition. I shall try to show in section 2, however, that what Grotius meant by using the common was limited to the consumption and uninterrupted physical possession of the fruits of the common. This differed from the more extended meaning found in Pufendorf, whereby use entails labor and storage. The difference is essentially between using things on the common and removing things from the common for private use. Grotius's more restricted concept of using the common did not require rights to, nor did it create new rights in, the things used. It was possible as a consequence of the original rights to perform actions that did not violate the rights of others. The first use of the common, therefore, is categorically different from occupation, and section 3 explores the precise nature of this difference to show why the agreement was necessary. My second aim is to argue that the interpretation of Grotius presented here points to a rather different assessment of the relationship between his theory and those of Pufendorf and Locke than is suggested by Schlatter and Tuck. Common property. In 1609, Grotius published a short work entitled Mare Liberum, which aimed to establish the principle that every nation is free to travel to every other nation and to trade with it. As part of this undertaking, Grotius argued that the sea was the common property of all nations, and that it must remain so. The sea was common in the same way that everything was common in ancient times before the introduction of laws of private property. No country could claim the sea as private property and exclude others from its use. Under the terms of the original gift of the world to mankind, there was no particular or private ownership. God had not given all things to this individual or to that, but to the entire human race, and thus a number of persons, as it were en masse, were not debarred from being substantially sovereigns or owners of the same thing. Sovereignty or ownership here meant the privilege of lawfully using common property. Nobody, therefore, could be debarred from using the same thing, but since the same thing cannot be used in the same way at the same time, it follows that, as a minimum, all things belong to him who had possession of them. However, there was no right to exclude others from a similar use, either before or after our possession. An implication of this seems to be that we must leave the common as we find it. But there are some things, Grotius says, such as food and drink, the use of which consists in their being used up. He concludes from this that the use is inseparable from a certain kind of ownership, because own implies that a thing belongs to some one person in such a way that it cannot belong to any other person. In De Jure Belli ac Pacis, which was published 16 years after Mare Liberum, Grotius says God had conferred upon the human race a general right over things of a lower nature, and in consequence of this general right, each man could at once take whatever he wished for his own needs, and could consume whatever was capable of being consumed. Whatever each had thus taken for his own needs, another could not take from him except by an unjust act. He says that reason and the nature of society do not prohibit all use of force, but only that use of force which is in conflict with society, that is, which attempts to take away the rights of another. This would be true even if private ownership had not been introduced, because life, limbs, and liberty would in that case be the possessions belonging to each, and no attack could be made upon these by another without injustice. Furthermore, under such conditions, the first one taking possession would have the right to use things not claimed, and to use them up to the limit of his needs, and any one depriving him of that right would commit an unjust act. There is then a right to use things not claimed, and a prohibition on the use of force to take away that right from another. Grotius cites Cicero's famous example of the public theatre to illustrate how the common gift can be used by individuals. Although the theater is a public place, yet it is correct to say that the seat a man has taken belongs to him. He then specifies the conditions under which the exercise of this primitive right is possible, namely, as long as people were content to live a simple life, that is, to live on the fruits which the earth brought forth of its own accord, without toil, or that if they had lived on terms of mutual affection. It is a point of considerable importance in Grotius's account that our life, limbs, and liberty are regarded as the possessions that comprise the natural sum, and that sum can be extended conventionally to include natural objects. It was precisely this point that Pufendorf was to deny, on the grounds that it is impossible to conceive how the mere corporal act of one person can prejudice the faculty of others, unless their consent is given. Pufendorf thinks that any kind of exclusive possession requires an agreement of some kind. For although after God had made the gift, nothing remained to prevent man from appropriating things to himself, yet there was a need of some sort of convention if it was to be understood that by such appropriation or seizure the right of others to that thing was excluded. Pufendorf, like Grotius, used the example of the equestrian seats belonging to all the Roman knights to illustrate how men originally made use of the common, but he takes it to illustrate that, so long as the actual bodies of things were not yet assigned to certain individuals, there was a tacit convention that each man could appropriate for his own use, primarily the fruits of things, what he wanted, and could consume what was consumable. Now the knights have a right to use the theatre in the sense that the seats belong to no one and are open to all, but they do not have the right that would enable them to demand that others make room for them if the theatre is full. In other words, they do not have a right to a seat. Pufendorf is pointing out that since the knights do not have a right to a seat, occupants cannot keep the seats they have taken by virtue of having a right to it. And he is making a further claim that the action of sitting down cannot create a right in a seat. An acquisition of a right in a seat is conventional, and is contingent on the other knights agreeing to it. Grotius, on the other hand, is pointing out that since the knights do not have a right to a seat, they cannot demand that seats are vacated. The occupants are only doing what they can lawfully do. In sitting in an unoccupied seat, they have not taken any away the rights of others, and so others cannot demand that they stop. It seems then, or at least it does to Grotius, that they do have a right of some kind that enables them to demand that they are not evicted. They do have a right to be there. So what kind of right do they have? The usual answer is that Grotius thinks the act of seizure somehow creates a right in the occupied seat. Horn, for instance, says it is important for the history of property rights that Grotius thought that a right could be created simply by the individual seizure. Oliver Crona understood Grotius in a much the same way and suggested that Grotius is making use of a natural and common idea. When a child has picked strawberries, they are said to be his or hers. If they are taken from the child by a naughty boy, this is acutely felt, not only because of the loss of the strawberries. The act is experienced by the child as an attack on itself, that is, on its personality.